Catherine Brennan had spent 27 years learning how not to want things. She was good at it. She'd buried her father, then her mother, then William, her last living kin, on a muddy field somewhere near the Canadian border that she never could find on any map. She'd gotten very good at loss. What she was not good at was standing outside a church in the August heat, about to marry a man she did not love, knowing the man she did love was somewhere inside waiting for her to walk in. She put her hand on the door. Her legs stopped. If this story already has your heart, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. You won't want to miss a single moment. The deacon found her first. Old Josiah Hale shuffled out from the side entrance of the church, took one look at Catherine, standing with her hand pressed flat against the door, and did what deacons do when they sense trouble brewing at a wedding. He cleared his throat. "Miss Bremen," his voice came out careful, measured. "They're waiting." "I know it," she said. "Mr. Ashfield's been at the altar near 20 minutes. "I know that too." He pulled at his collar. The silence stretched out between them, thick with August heat. "You feeling all right, miss?" "Fine," Catherine said. "Perfectly fine." She was not fine. She was 27 years old, wearing her mother's good dress, standing outside a church in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the dead heat of August 1815, about to marry a man she did not love. That part she'd made her peace with months ago. That part she'd folded up and put away, the same way she'd learned to fold up every other thing she couldn't have. What she hadn't made peace with was the other thing. The thing with gray eyes and a way of seeing that cut right through every wall she'd ever built. "Give me a moment," she said. Josiah looked at the sky, which was not his concern, and then back at her, which was. "Yes, miss," he said, and retreated. Catherine kept her hand on the door and thought about William. Her brother had died in November of 1813 on a field near the Canadian border. The Army's notice had arrived 2 weeks later. It used words like valor and sacrifice and in service of his country. And every one of those words had meant nothing at all to her. What meant something was the letter that arrived 5 days after, handwritten, brief, from a man she had never met. "Miss Brennan, I was with your brother when he passed. He did not suffer long. He spoke of you at the end, not of the plantation, not of debts or what would become of things, only of you. He asked me to see that you were looked after. I am not a man who makes promises lightly. I am a man who keeps them. With respect, Adrian Ashfield." She'd read it 4 times. Then she put it in the fire. Martha had been standing in the doorway, watching. She'd been with the Brennan family 18 years. She'd helped raise Catherine, and she knew her the way only people who've seen you at your worst and your youngest ever really know anyone. She said nothing while the paper burned. Then she said, "What did it say?" "That William's gone," Catherine said, "and that someone intends to do something about it." "Someone rich?" "Adrian Ashfield." Martha went still, in the particular way she did when something mattered more than she wanted to show. "The older Ashfield boy, the one who came back from the war." "He's 32 years old, Martha. He is not a boy." "What does he mean to do?" "Find me a husband." Catherine looked at her hands. They were steady. She'd learned to keep them steady. "It's what William asked of him, I expect." Martha was quiet for a long moment. The fire cracked. Outside, the October wind moved through the old oaks. "And what do you want, Catherine?" Martha asked. She didn't answer that. She couldn't afford to answer that. Not then, and not now, standing outside this church, with the organ beginning to moan faintly through the door. Adrian Ashfield had come to see the property himself in April, without writing ahead. She'd been in the East Field, arguing with her foreman about the drainage situation, when she'd looked up and seen him at the field's edge, sitting his horse like he'd been there all morning and had no intention of leaving. She'd known who he was before a single word passed between them. There was something in the way he sat, settled, certain, not performing anything for anyone, that matched exactly the voice she'd given him in her mind when she'd read his letter. She walked to him. That wasn't proper. She hadn't cared. "Mr. Ashfield," she said. He dismounted in one clean motion and stood facing her. He was taller than she'd expected, dark-haired, with a face that had weather in it, and lines that came from thinking hard rather than from ease. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of mountains in winter, and they moved over her with a directness that had nothing of pity in it. Not assessment, exactly. Something closer to recognition. "Miss Brennan." He said her name like it was a fact he'd confirmed. "I apologize for the unannounced call." "You could have written." "I could have." He didn't make excuses for the fact that he hadn't. She found she liked that. "I wanted to see the property." "You mean you wanted to see if it was worth saving?" Something shifted behind his eyes. Not offense, but the look of a man revising what he thought he already knew. "I wanted to see how you were managing." "I'm managing fine." "Your Eastfield drainage is failing." She stared at him. "How do you—" "Your foreman mentioned it to the feed merchant in town. The feed merchant repeated it to half of Charlottesville." He said it without apology or judgment, just the plain shape of the thing. "It isn't a secret, Miss Brennan." She'd tried to be angry about that. She'd searched for it and couldn't find it, because there was no condescension in what he said, no softening. Just the situation, laid flat and honest. "Are you here to help or to assess?" "Both," he said, "if you'll allow it." She allowed it. He spent the better part of 2 hours walking her land with her, and he asked questions she hadn't expected from a man of his position. About soil composition in the lower fields, about the mill's weekly capacity, about which creditors held first position and which were simply making the most noise. He didn't explain things she already knew. He didn't look past her to the foreman when she spoke. He just looked at the problems the way she looked at them, directly, without flinching. And she had the disorienting sensation of being seen by someone for the first time in a very long while. When he walked back to his horse at the end, he said, "My brother will take good care of you." It landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. She'd felt the ripple of it for a week. Martha had known what that visit meant before Catherine admitted it to herself. The morning after, she'd set tea on the table and looked at Catherine with the expression that meant her conclusions were already formed, and she was waiting to see if Catherine would catch up. "He's not what you expected," Martha said. It wasn't a question. "No." "What were you expecting?" "Someone who pitied me." Catherine turned her cup in her hands. "He doesn't. He just sees things the way they are, not the way he wants them to be." "That's a dangerous quality in a man," Martha said quietly. "Yes," Catherine agreed. "It is." Martha was quiet for a moment. Then, gently but plainly, "He's the brother, Catherine. I know who he is. Oliver's the one you're marrying." "I know that too." Martha looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Catherine had to look away. "All right," Martha said at last. "All right. Drink your tea." She never brought it up again. But when Catherine had come home early from the Whitmore dinner party in late July, having spent half the evening standing on one side of the room while Adrian stood on the other, both of them precisely, carefully, not looking at each other. Martha had made tea without being asked, and hadn't said a word. And that silence had been worse than anything she could have said. Oliver came in May, the same month as the accident. He arrived on a fine gray horse, with his hat in his hand and a smile that traveled most of the way to his eyes. He was handsome in a comfortable sort of way, and he said all the right things about the property and her resilience, and how much he admired the way she'd managed alone these past years. She sat across from him in the parlor and thought, "This is what kindness looks like when it's arranged in advance." "My brother speaks highly of you," Oliver said. "Your brother doesn't know me." He paused, recalibrated, the same way Adrian had, though it looked different on him. Less certainty recovered, more genuine surprise. "He knew William well. He says that tells him a great deal about the kind of woman you are." "My brother was a man," Catherine said. "I am something else entirely." "Yes," Oliver said, and there was something genuine in it, something almost startled. "I can see that." He proposed 3 weeks later in a letter. She wrote back yes, because her creditors had come twice in April, and because she was 27 and unmarried in Virginia, and because the only other road was becoming the kind of woman people looked at sideways and felt quietly sorry for. She would not be that woman. Oliver returned in June to settle the legal arrangements with her solicitor. When the solicitor had gathered his papers and gone, they sat alone in the parlor, and Oliver set down his hat and looked at her with something real behind his eyes. "I want to be honest with you," he said. She waited. "I didn't come to this arrangement the way a man usually comes to a marriage. You know that." "I do." "I mean to be a good husband to you." He said it without decoration, without performance. "Not because Adrian asked it of me, because you deserve it. I can see that plain enough." She studied him and thought, "He's a better man than I've given him credit for. He's just not the right one." "Oliver," she said carefully, "are you happy with this? Honestly?" He thought before he answered. That surprised her, that he actually thought. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm willing to try to be, which isn't the same as happy, but it's what I've got." Something in her eased, just slightly. "Then we have something in common." He smiled at that, small and real. He picked up his hat. "I'll see you at the church," he said. "I'll be there," she told him. She had meant it, too. She'd meant it all the way up until she'd put her hand on that church door and felt her whole body try to refuse. The accident had come 3 weeks before Oliver's first visit, in the 3rd week of May. She'd taken Sable out before sunrise because she couldn't sleep, and she'd been pushing the mare hard along the north ridge when Sable's front leg found the rabbit hole. The fall was fast and wrong. She hit the ground shoulder first and felt something in the joint give, not break, but wrench badly enough that the world went white for 2 full seconds. Sable scrambled upright and stood trembling 10 feet away. Catherine tried to push herself up. Her left arm had nothing in it. "Don't move." The voice came from her left. She turned toward it, which sent pain burning from her shoulder to the back of her teeth. And Adrian Ashfield was already off his horse and moving toward her before she could get a word out. "I said don't move," he said, dropping to a crouch beside her. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Your shoulder's out of the socket." He said it the same way he said everything. No wasted words, no alarm dressed up as concern. His hands moved to her shoulder with a steadiness that meant he'd done this before. "This is going to hurt." Then stop talking about it and... It hurt. It hurt badly enough that her vision sharpened to a point at the edges. She did not make a sound, and he saw that it cost her, and his jaw went tight. "Done," he said. She tested the arm. It moved. Reluctantly, but it moved. "You've done that before." The war. He was still close. Closer than was proper. His eyes weren't on her shoulder anymore. They were on her face, checking for something that had nothing to do with the joint. "You shouldn't ride alone this early." "I've ridden alone since I was 9 years old." "That's not a reason." "It's my reason." He almost smiled. She saw the very beginning of it, a softening at the corner of his mouth, before he caught it and pulled it back. He stood and offered his hand. She took it, because the alternative was struggling up from the dirt in front of him, which was worse. He let go the moment she had her footing. "Why are you on this ridge?" she asked. "Your property ends 2 miles south." He picked up his reins. When he turned back to her, something had changed in his face. Something had come through the careful exterior. Just a crack. Just enough. "Catherine." She went still at the sound of her name without permission. He seemed to know he'd crossed a line. He paused. "My brother," he said, steadying himself, "is a good man." "I know he is." "He'll be good to you." "I know that too." He nodded. Once, deliberate, like a man settling an argument he'd been having with himself for a long time. "I'm glad," he said. And then he turned his horse south and rode away without looking back. She stood in that field until the sun came all the way up. Sable pressed her nose against Catherine's good shoulder, looking for reassurance. Catherine put her forehead against the mare's neck and held very still. She'd made her peace with it that morning. Or she'd told herself she had. "Miss Brennan," Josiah's voice again. Patient. Waiting. "Coming," Catherine said. She pushed the door open and walked inside. The organ started, low and solemn, and the congregation rose, and Catherine fixed her eyes on the altar and walked. She counted her steps the way she always counted things when she needed to not feel them. 1, 2, 3. She didn't look at faces in the pews. She didn't search for anyone she knew. She looked straight ahead. She looked at the altar. And stopped. The man standing at the altar was not Oliver Ashfield. She knew it before she saw his face. She knew it from the set of his shoulders, from the way he stood, rooted, certain, like he'd been placed on this earth to stand in exactly this spot and had known it his whole life. From the stillness of him. Oliver had never been still a day in his life. His eyes found hers the moment she stopped walking. Gray. The precise gray of mountains in winter. Adrian Ashfield stood at the altar with his hands at his sides and his face open in a way she had never once seen it open before. No controlled exterior. No careful neutrality arranged for the benefit of a watching world. Just him. Just the plain truth of him, offered without pretense. The organ played 3 more notes and stumbled to silence. 100 people held their breath. Adrian took 1 step toward her. 1 deliberate step, the same way he did everything. Like he'd thought it through and decided, and now there was nothing left to do but do it. "Catherine," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name without her giving him permission. The first time he'd said it like he'd earned it. Like he'd been carrying it around inside him for months and months, waiting for the single moment when saying it out loud was the only honest thing left to do. The whole church held still, and Catherine Brennan, who had spent 27 years becoming very, very good at not wanting things, felt everything she'd folded up and put away come flooding back at once. The whole church held still, and Catherine did not move. She could feel every set of eyes in that room pressing against her skin like heat from a fire. The Whitmore women in the second pew, Mrs. Caldwell with her mouth already open, the Reverend Stokes gripping his Bible with both hands like the ground was moving beneath him. She felt all of it. She did not look at any of them. She looked at Adrian. "Where is Oliver?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than it had any right to. It carried through the church the way voices do when everything has gone quiet at once. Adrian didn't flinch. "He's not coming, Catherine." A sound moved through the congregation, not quite a gasp, more like a collective exhale of something that had been held too long. Someone in the back pew stood up. She didn't turn to see who. "That's not an answer," she said. "He asked me to come in his place." Adrian took another step toward her. He was close enough now that she could see the careful set of his jaw, the way a muscle worked there, like he was choosing every word before he let it loose. "He wrote me a letter. 3 days ago." "You're lying." "I'm not." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and held out a folded piece of paper. She didn't take it. "Read it yourself," he said. "Or don't. But I'm not lying to you." Reverend Stokes stepped forward from the altar, clearing his throat with the particular authority of a man who has presided over many disasters and intends to manage this one. "Perhaps we ought to, that is to say, if there's been some misunderstanding—" "There hasn't," Adrian said, without looking at him. The Reverend went silent. Several people in the front pews sat back down. Catherine still hadn't moved from where she'd stopped in the aisle. She was aware of the distance between herself and the door. 12 steps, maybe 14. And the distance between herself and the altar, about the same. She was standing exactly in the middle of nowhere, which seemed appropriate. "You should have written me," she said. "I know it." "You should have told me before I walked through that door." "Yes," he said, "I should have." And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it, the same way she could always hear when he was telling her the plain truth about something. It didn't help. "Adrian." She said his name low and direct, so it went only to him. "What did Oliver's letter say?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said that he wasn't in love with you, and that he thought you deserved someone who was. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. Mrs. Caldwell made a sound that might have been sympathy or might have been the beginning of gossip. It was difficult to tell with Mrs. Caldwell. Someone else in the pews whispered something to their neighbor. The Reverend had retreated 3 full steps and appeared to be reconsidering his entire vocation. Catherine felt the heat come up in her face and fought it back down. 27 years of practice. She was good at this. "So he sent you," she said. "To do what exactly? Stand here in his place? Tell me in front of 100 people that the man I was going to marry decided I wasn't worth showing up for?" "No." Adrian's voice didn't waver. "He sent me because he knew I would come. Because he knew I was the only person in this situation who wanted to be here." That landed. She felt it land and couldn't move for a full second. "That's not fair," she said quietly. "I know." "You don't get to... You can't just... Adrian." She stopped, started again. "You had months. You had months to say something, and you said nothing." "I know that too." "Then why now?" Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough that she heard it and hated it. "Why in front of God and every person in Charlottesville is now the moment you choose." He took the last step between them. He was close enough now that she had to look up to hold his eyes. And she held them, because she would not look away from this, whatever this was. "Because," he said very quietly, "I was trying to do right by you, and I got it wrong. And I'm asking you to let me try again." Nobody in that church breathed. Catherine stared at him. Behind all her walls, behind every folded-up feeling she'd put away since the day William's letter arrived, something she had no name for was pressing hard against the inside of her chest, trying to get out. She looked down at the folded paper he still held. "Give me the letter," she said. He placed it in her hand. She unfolded it right there in the middle of the aisle, in front of every soul in that room. Her eyes moved across Oliver's handwriting. She recognized it from his proposal letter, the same clean, careful script. "Adrian, you know better than I do what the right thing is here. You always have. Don't waste it this time." Oh. 5 lines. She'd expected more. Somehow, 5 lines were worse. She folded the paper back along its creases and held it at her side. She looked at Adrian. He was watching her with that steady gray attention she'd never been able to tolerate and never been able to look away from. "You told him," she said. "You told Oliver." Something shifted in his face. "Not exactly." "What does that mean, not exactly?" "He figured it out on his own." Adrian's voice had dropped lower, meant only for her now, though she had no illusions that the first 2 rows couldn't hear every syllable. "He's known me 32 years. He said watching me around you was like watching a man try to walk through a wall. Very committed, entirely useless." She almost laughed. She stopped herself, but it was a near thing. "He's not angry?" she said. "He said to tell you he's sorry, that he should have spoken up 3 months ago, but he convinced himself he was being honorable." A beat. He wasn't. He was just afraid of the conversation. "He sounds like someone else I know." Adrian took that without argument. The Reverend, having apparently located his courage somewhere in the region of the 3rd row, stepped forward again. "I really must, Reverend Stokes," Catherine said, without turning around. "I would be very grateful if you would give me 1 minute." There was a pause. "Of course, Miss Brennan." She turned back to Adrian and looked at him straight. "You're asking me something," she said, "right now, in front of everyone. You're asking me something, and you haven't said it out loud yet. Say it." He held her gaze, and then, without performance, without decoration, like a man who had run out of ways to protect himself, and decided that was all right. "Marry me." 2 words. 2 plain words, and the entire church erupted. Mrs. Caldwell had been holding herself together through extraordinary effort, and apparently felt 2 words was all she could manage. She pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, with a sound that was definitely crying. Several other women followed. The Whitmore men were on their feet, talking to each other in sharp undertones. Old Josiah Hale, who had taken his seat in the last pew, had his eyes closed, like a man praying with real urgency. Catherine looked at Adrian and thought about all the times he had not said this. All the evenings in the parlor when the conversation had edged close and then pulled back. Every careful, deliberate act of restraint she'd watched him perform. She thought about the accident on the North Ridge. She thought about the way he'd said her name, Catherine, not Miss Brennan, when he'd come across her in the field, before he'd caught himself and put the walls back up. She thought about Martha, who was sitting in the 5th pew on the left, and had not, Catherine knew without looking, made a single sound. "You put your brother in an impossible position," she said. "You know that." "Yes." "You let me believe I was going to marry a man I didn't love because you were too proud to say a word." "Yes." "You are the most frustrating man I have ever met in my life." "I know it," he said, and there was something in it, just a thread of something warm and raw and terrified, that broke through every last guard she had. She heard herself say, "Yes." The church went to pieces. Mrs. Caldwell stopped trying to hold anything together. The Whitmore women clutched each other. Old Josiah said amen loud enough to be heard in the back courtyard. The Reverend, to his considerable credit, recovered faster than anyone and stepped forward with his Bible before anyone could change their mind. Adrian took her hand. He held it the way he did everything, like he'd made a decision and intended to keep it. His hand was warm. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't let herself think about it before. The Reverend cleared his throat. His voice had gone slightly unsteady, which was more than fair. Well, right then. In the sight of God and these witnesses, do you, Adrian James Ashfield— Wait, Catherine said. Everyone stopped. Again. She turned to Adrian. He was looking at her with something that might have been alarm for the first time since she'd known him. I need to ask you something first, she said. All right, he said carefully. Before any words get said in front of God and the Reverend and every gossip in Charlottesville, she kept her voice low enough that only he could hear it, though she didn't fool herself that it worked. I need to know if this is about William. If you're standing here because you made a promise to a dead man and you don't know how to break it. Adrian was quiet for a moment. The quiet had weight to it. In the beginning, he said, maybe. Some of it. He said it straight, no flinching. She'd come to expect that from him, and she'd never stopped being grateful for it. When I first came to see the property, I came because I promised William. When I came back in April, I told myself the same thing. And after April? After April, he said slowly. I came back because I couldn't not. She waited. I tried to stop, he said. I thought, if Oliver married you, if I did right by my brother, if I gave you a good life through a good man and kept my distance, I thought eventually it would pass. His jaw tightened. It didn't. Adrian, I'm not here for William, he said. I'm here because you're the most honest, stubborn, infuriating woman I've ever encountered in my life, and I have no idea how to want anything other than whatever future you're willing to give me. That's the truth of it. All of it. She let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 6 months. All right, she said. He searched her face. All right as in, yes, I believe you. She looked at their joined hands. And all right as in, I've been folding this up and putting it away since April, and I am extremely tired of doing that. The corner of his mouth moved. Folding what up? Don't make me say it in front of the Reverend. He almost laughed. She heard it, the beginning of it in his exhale, and it was the first real unguarded sound she'd ever heard from him, and it went straight through her like sunlight. Reverend Stokes, she said, turning back to the altar and pulling Adrian with her because she was still holding his hand. I believe we were interrupted. The Reverend looked at them both. He looked at the congregation, which was in varying states of disarray. He looked at his Bible. Right, he said, with the composure of a man who had decided this was a story he'd be telling for the rest of his life, and he might as well tell it well. Where were we? The ceremony took 11 minutes. Catherine had been told her first wedding would be one of the most important days of her life, and she supposed that was true, though nothing about it resembled what she'd been told to expect. There were women crying in the pews who hadn't been invited to cry. There was a man in the second row who started clapping when the Reverend said, "You may," and was immediately hushed by his wife. There was old Josiah in the back, still saying quiet amens every 30 seconds or so. And there was Adrian, looking at her like he intended to keep looking at her for a very long time, and had made his peace with that. When it was over, when the Reverend had said the words and the congregation had erupted a third time, and she'd signed her name next to his in the church register, she stood with her hand still in his, and felt the exact strangeness of having arrived somewhere she hadn't planned to go and finding that it fit her perfectly. Martha found her in the church entryway before anyone else could. She came through the crowd with the particular efficiency of a woman who has navigated every disaster in a family's history and knew how to cut a path through human chaos. She stopped in front of Catherine and looked at her. Then she looked at Adrian with an expression that wasn't quite a warning and wasn't quite approval, but sat somewhere in the exact middle. "Mr. Ashfield," she said. "Ma'am," he said. "You put this girl through 6 months of unnecessary suffering." "Yes, ma'am, I did." She considered him. "You intend to make up for it?" "Every day I have left." Another pause. Then Martha turned back to Catherine and said, with the dignity of a woman who had been right about something for a long time and wasn't going to make a production of it, "Drink your tea when it's hot." Catherine stared at her. "I've been telling you that for 20 years, Martha said. "It applies to everything." She squeezed Catherine's hand once, firm and brief. "Congratulations, girl." And she walked back into the church. Adrian watched her go. "Is she always like that?" "Always," Catherine said. "Good," he said. And then the crowd descended on them both, and the morning that had started with Catherine's hand on a church door and her feet refusing to move became something entirely different. Something loud and warm and full of people saying her name like it meant something good. She stood in the middle of it with her hands still in Adrian's, and she let it happen. Outside, somewhere down the road toward the Ashfield estate, Oliver was riding with his hat pulled low and his horse at an easy pace, and, she would later learn, he was smiling. Not the wide smile he performed for parties, something smaller and quieter, and entirely his own. A man who had done the right thing, finally, and was riding toward whatever came next. But that was a story for another time. Right now, Catherine Brennan, Catherine Ashfield as of 11 minutes ago, was standing in a church doorway in Charlottesville, Virginia, on an August morning in 1815, with a man who had spent 6 months trying not to love her and had failed completely. She thought that was probably enough to be going on with. She was wrong, of course. The hard part was only just beginning. The hard part arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the wedding, in the form of a letter delivered by a man who wouldn't meet her eyes. Catherine was in the study when it came. Adrian had ridden out to the South Fields before sunrise. There was always something with the South Fields. And she was alone at the desk with the household ledgers when the housekeeper, Mrs. Pell, appeared in the doorway with a particular expression she reserved for bad news and poorly cooked meat. "Letter for you, Mrs. Ashfield," she said. Catherine took it. She read the name on the outside. Not her new name, her old one, Miss C. Brennan. Someone who hadn't heard, or someone who didn't intend to acknowledge it. She opened it. It was from the Charlottesville Savings and Trust. The letter was 3 paragraphs long and used very polite language to say something very impolite. The creditors who held the Brennan property liens had called their notes. All of them. At once. The total figure was written at the bottom of the page in clean, black ink. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she folded it exactly the way she'd folded everything else that had tried to break her over the years. Carefully, along its original creases, and put it in the desk drawer. She sent for Martha. Martha came in, looked at Catherine's face, and sat down without being asked. "What is it?" "Someone's called the Brennan notes." "All of them?" "All of them, simultaneously." Catherine kept her voice even. "That doesn't happen by accident." Martha was quiet. Outside, a door opened somewhere in the house, one of the maids, and then closed again. "Who holds those notes?" 3 different creditors, all unrelated. Or they were unrelated. Catherine looked at the desk drawer. Someone coordinated this. To what end? To force the property into judgment before the marriage could protect it legally. She said it the way Adrian said things, just the plain shape of it, no softening. The wedding was 3 weeks ago. If someone wanted to strip the Brennan land before my new husband's name could be attached to it, they needed to move fast. Martha's expression had gone very still. The kind of still that meant she was putting things together faster than she was letting on. Who would want the Brennan land badly enough to— I don't know yet, Catherine said. She stood up. But I'm going to find out. She rode to the solicitor's office herself, without waiting for Adrian. She told herself it was because he was in the South Fields and couldn't be reached quickly. She told herself it wasn't because she was afraid of what his face would do when she told him she'd brought debt into this marriage, along with everything else. She was very good at lying to herself. She'd had practice. Thomas Greer, her solicitor, was a small man with large spectacles and the anxious energy of someone who delivered bad news for a living and had never gotten comfortable with it. He stood when she came in, which was more than most men did, and gestured for her to sit, which she didn't. "You've seen the letter," he said. "I've seen it. Tell me who's behind it." Greer sat back down. He took off his spectacles and polished them, which was what he did when he was choosing his words. "I've been looking into that this morning. The 3 creditor firms are separate entities on paper, but when I trace back the purchase of those notes," he set the spectacles back on his nose, "they were all acquired within the same 2-week period, 6 months ago." Catherine went very still. 6 months ago. May of this year. May. The same month Oliver had come to propose. The same month she'd fallen from Sable on the North Ridge, and Adrian had— "Who bought them?" she said. Greer hesitated. That hesitation told her everything before he opened his mouth. "A holding company, registered in Richmond. The principal investor is," he looked at his papers, "a Mr. Gerald Whitmore." The name hit her like cold water. Gerald Whitmore. 70 years old, 3 generations of Virginia land, more money than conscience, and a standing offer on the Brennan property that her father had turned down twice before he died. He had smiled at her funeral, afterward, at the gathering. A polite, patient smile. The smile of a man who knew how to wait. "He bought my debt," she said. "In May." "Yes. While I was being courted by Oliver Ashfield, while everyone in Charlottesville assumed I would marry Oliver, and that any debt would pass to the Ashfield estate." She pressed her hands flat on the desk. "He bought it expecting that the Ashfields would have to negotiate with him, that he'd get the land at his price or he'd call the notes and take it through judgment." Greer said nothing. He didn't have to. "But then I didn't marry Oliver," Catherine said quietly. "No," Greer agreed. "You married Adrian. And Adrian is not a man who negotiates from a weak position." She straightened. "So Whitmore called the notes immediately, before Adrian could pay them off and close the door." "That's my assessment, yes." She was already moving toward the door. "Mrs. Ashfield." Greer's voice stopped her. "The figure on those notes, even for a man of Mr. Ashfield's standing, it is considerable." "I know what it is, Thomas. There's also a time constraint, 30 days from the letter's date." "I know that too." She opened the door. "Thank you." She rode home faster than she'd ridden out. Adrian was back from the South Fields by the time she arrived. She could hear him in the front hall, talking to one of the stable hands about a fencing issue, and she came through the door before the stable hand finished his sentence and said, "I need to speak with you. Now." Adrian looked at her face and said to the stable hand, "Tomorrow." The man was gone in seconds. She put the letter on the hall table between them and watched his eyes move across it. watched his face go through the thing that was almost no expression at all. The Adrian Ashfield version of alarm, which was a very slight tightening around the eyes and a stillness in the jaw that meant his mind was moving fast. He read it twice. Then he set it down. "Whitmore," he said. She stared at him. "You knew his name before I said it." A pause. One single, terrible pause. "Yes." "Adrian." I suspected. He met her eyes. He always met her eyes. She would give him that forever, no matter what else happened. When Oliver came to see the property in May, he mentioned that someone had been asking around about the Brennan debt. He thought it was idle gossip. I didn't. "You didn't tell me." "I didn't have enough to tell you. I had a suspicion and no proof, and you were—" He stopped. "I was what?" "You were already managing 12 things at once and trusting no one and carrying everything alone." His voice was controlled, but something under it was not. "I thought if I was wrong, I'd have frightened you for nothing. I thought if I was right, I'd find out more before I said anything." "You didn't find out more." "No," he said. "I didn't. I got distracted." She knew what that meant. She knew what had distracted him and when it had started. And she could be angry at him for that. She wanted to be angry at him. It was easier. But she couldn't get there. "What do we do?" she said. "I pay them off." He said it without hesitation, without calculation. "Today, if I can reach the bank." "It's a considerable sum." "I know what it is. I looked into the notes before—" He stopped again. She tilted her head. "Before what?" Something moved across his face. It was the look he'd had on the North Ridge when he'd said, "My brother is a good man," and turned his horse south. The look of a man who has just done something he can't quite take back. "Adrian," she said slowly, "when did you look into my debt?" "Catherine, when?" He held her gaze. That was the thing about him. He always held her gaze, even when it cost him. "April," he said. April. He'd come to walk the land in April. He'd asked about creditors holding first position. He'd said it like it was just part of assessing the property situation. Like it was information he was gathering because that was what a practical man did. She'd been grateful for his directness. She'd told herself he was just thorough. "You knew then," she said. "I knew the debt was being acquired. I didn't know by whom." "But you knew someone was moving on it." "Yes." She walked away from him, 3 steps, then turned back. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. Right now she hated herself for it. "Is that why you came back? In June? In July? Every time you came back to this house? Was it to watch over the situation? Was I a situation you were managing?" "No." He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. "No, Catherine. Look at me." She looked at him. "In the beginning," he said, "I came because of William. I told you that. I'm telling you again because it's true, and I'm not going to hide from it. But everything after April, every time I came back after that morning in the East Field, that was not about William. That was not about debt or land or doing right by anyone's memory." He stopped. "I need you to know the difference." "Why?" "Because I need you to know I'm not here because you needed saving." His voice had dropped to something raw and unguarded. "I'm here because I couldn't find a way to be anywhere else." She breathed. The room was very quiet. "Pay the notes," she said at last. He exhaled, just slightly. "I'll go now." "And Adrian," she stopped him with his name. "When you come back, we're going to talk about Whitmore. Not just the debt, what he's actually after, and what we're going to do about it. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. We are. He was gone within the hour. He came back at dusk with the bank receipts in his coat pocket and Gerald Whitmore's response in his hand. Because Whitmore, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this. The man had sent a letter to the bank before Adrian arrived, marked urgent, laying out an alternative proposal. He would forgive the notes entirely, no payment required, in exchange for the eastern section of the Brennan property. 140 acres. The good acres. The mill land. Catherine read the letter standing up. He thinks, she said slowly, that you'll take the easy road, that you'll decide 140 acres is a reasonable price to pay to make this go away. He's wrong, Adrian said. He's also telling us something. She set the letter down. He doesn't want the money. He could have taken the payment today. You were at the bank. He stopped it because he wants the land. He's wanted the land since before my father died. She pressed her fingers to her temple. This isn't about money. This is about the mill. Adrian was looking at her with that focused, steady attention. What about the mill? My father turned him down twice. You know why? She looked at the letter. Because of the river access. The Brennan Mill sits on the only point where the Rivanna narrows enough to run a second wheel. Any man who controls that mill controls the grain processing for 6 farms east of town. Whitmore's been expanding east for 3 years. He needs that mill. Adrian went very still. He needs it to corner the market. He needs it to corner the market, she confirmed. And he figured a woman alone, buried in debt, would be easier to acquire it from than my father was. He figured wrong. He figured wrong twice, Catherine said. Once when he thought I'd sell, and again when he thought I'd marry someone he could outmaneuver. She met Adrian's eyes. He didn't expect you. Something changed in his face. Not pride exactly, but the look of a man who had just decided that the fight he was in was worth having. What do you want to do? I want to go see him, she said. Tomorrow. Both of us. Adrian considered that. He'll expect me to go alone. He'll expect to negotiate man to man, with you waiting at home. I know. You want to walk in there and take that away from him. I want to walk in there, Catherine said, and make absolutely clear that the Brennan Mill is not for sale at any price, and that the next time he reaches for something that belongs to this family, there will be consequences he hasn't accounted for. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, You sound exactly like your brother. She felt the grief of that, sharp and brief, and let it pass through. William would have hated every second of this. Yes, Adrian said. He would have loved watching you do it. They went the next morning. Whitmore's estate was 12 miles east, at the end of a long drive lined with old oaks that were meant to impress. Catherine sat straight in the carriage and did not let them impress her. Gerald Whitmore met them in his front parlor. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with white hair and the manner of someone who had been the most powerful person in every room for so long that he'd forgotten it was a choice. He looked at Catherine, then at Adrian, and something moved through his eyes. Surprise, recalculated quickly into something more careful. Mr. Ashfield, he said, I didn't expect both of you. I know, Catherine said. That's why we both came. Whitmore turned to her. He smiled, the same patient smile from the funeral gathering, the smile of a man who thought he had time. Mrs. Ashfield, I've always admired your directness. Then I'll be direct, she said. The mill is not for sale. I wasn't aware I'd asked to buy it. You asked for the east section. The east section is the mill access. You know that as well as I do." She held his gaze. "The notes are paid. That avenue is closed. So whatever you imagined you were purchasing in May when you acquired my family's debt, I want you to understand clearly that it no longer exists." Whitmore shifted. His smile hadn't moved, but something behind it had. "You're making assumptions about my intentions." "I'm making observations about your actions," she said. "There's a difference." Adrian had not said a single word. He stood slightly to her left, and he was watching Whitmore with the gray, unblinking attention of a man who was cataloging every micro-expression, every small tell. Catherine had positioned this precisely. Whitmore needed to talk to her because she was the one speaking, but he couldn't stop looking at Adrian because Adrian was the unknown quantity in the room, and that uncertainty was the most powerful thing they'd brought with them. Whitmore tried one more time. He turned to Adrian directly, man to man, the old language. "Ashfield, I've a proposal that would benefit us both. A fair—" "You'll speak to my wife," Adrian said. His voice was very quiet and very final. "She's made her position plain." The silence that followed had edges on it. Whitmore looked between them. For the first time, the patience cracked, just slightly, just enough to see what was underneath it. He'd planned for a transaction. He'd gotten something else entirely. "I see," he said. "I hope so," Catherine said, "because I'll also tell you this, Mr. Whitmore. I've written to 2 other mill operators in the county, men who've been watching your east expansion with some concern. If anything should happen to the Brennan mill, flooding, fire, anything that strains credulity as an accident, there are people who will know exactly where to look." The temperature in the room dropped. Whitmore stared at her. He'd expected a woman come to negotiate the terms of her surrender. He had not expected this. "That's a serious accusation," he said softly. "It's a serious precaution," she said. "I'm simply being direct, as you said you admired." She stood. Adrian stood with her. "Good day, Mr. Whitmore," she said. They were at the carriage before Whitmore found his voice again. "Mrs. Ashfield." She stopped, but didn't turn. "You're very like your father." She turned then. "I know it," she said. "He turned you down twice. So will I." She got into the carriage. Adrian followed. They were half a mile down the drive before either of them spoke. "He's not done," Adrian said. "No," she agreed. "He's not." "He'll find another way to come at this." "He'll try." She looked out at the road ahead. "But we know what he wants now. That's not nothing." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where did you learn to do that?" She glanced at him. "Do what?" "Walk into a room that belongs to someone else and make it yours." She thought about her father, who had done exactly that in every room he ever entered. She thought about William, who had learned it from him. She thought about 27 years of being the one left behind, the one managing alone, the one who had gotten very good at holding things together because no one else was going to do it. "I've been practicing," she said. He looked at her, that gray, steady look that she'd stopped trying to deflect 3 weeks ago. There was something in it that she still hadn't found a word for. Something that sat between pride and awe, and something else that was quieter than either. "Catherine," he said, "don't say it. I haven't said anything yet." "You're going to say something that sounds like an apology for the last 6 months, and I don't want it." She turned to look at him. "I want you to stop apologizing and start trusting that I can hold my own in this." He was quiet. "I can," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I've known it since April. That was never the question." Then what was? He held her gaze for a long, steady moment. Whether you'd let me stand next to you while you did it. She didn't have an answer for that. She didn't need one. She turned back to the road. Outside, the Virginia morning was moving into afternoon, and the oaks were turning in the wind, and somewhere behind them, Gerald Whitmore was sitting in his parlor, revising his plans. And Catherine Ashfield, née Brennan, daughter of Thomas, sister of William, wife of a man she hadn't planned to love, was sitting in a carriage 12 miles from home, with her hands folded steady in her lap, thinking that the fight ahead was going to be harder than today. She found she wasn't afraid of it. That surprised her more than anything else that had happened in the last 3 weeks. Not the wedding, not the debt, not Whitmore's patience, or Adrian's honesty, or Martha's quiet, enduring certainty. The surprise was this. Catherine Brennan had spent her whole life bracing for things that hadn't broken her. And somewhere between a church door and a carriage seat on a Tuesday afternoon, she had stopped bracing. Whatever came next, she was ready to meet it, standing. Whitmore moved faster than either of them expected. The first sign came 4 days after the carriage ride home, when Jacob Mercer, who ran the feed operation 2 miles north of the Brennan Mill and had done business with the Brennan family for 11 years, stopped sending his grain. No letter, no explanation, just a silence where there had always been a handshake and a schedule. Catherine rode to see him herself. Jacob met her at his gate. He was a good man, a square-built, sun-weathered man who'd known her father and had looked her in the eye at William's memorial and said he was sorry, like he meant it. He couldn't look her in the eye now. He looked at his boots. He looked at the fence post. He looked everywhere that wasn't her face. "Jacob," she said. "Mrs. Ashfield." He'd used her new name, at least. "I'm sorry, I am. But I can't. I've got a family to think about. Whitmore controls the Eastern grain contracts, all of them. If he pulls those contracts from me—" "He threatened you," she said. "He didn't threaten." Jacob's jaw worked. "He just made things clear. Said the men who do business with the Ashfield mill might find themselves without buyers come harvest season." He finally looked at her. His eyes were miserable. "I can't absorb that, Catherine. I've got 4 children." She sat with that for a moment. The anger was there. She felt it the way she always felt it, clean and cold and useful. But she didn't let it land on Jacob. He was scared. Scared men were not the enemy. Scared men were the evidence. "I understand," she said. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I know you are." She turned her horse. "Thank you for telling me to my face." She was back on the road before she let herself think it through. Whitmore wasn't coming at the mill directly, not after their conversation. He was smarter than that. He was going around her. Cutting off the mill's suppliers one by one, quietly, with no letter she could take to a judge and no action she could call by its name. By harvest season, if he was thorough enough, the Brennan mill would be running at a fraction of its capacity. Not because he'd taken it, because he'd made it not worth having. Adrian listened to all of it that evening without interrupting. He had a quality she'd come to depend on. This ability to hear bad news without reaching immediately for the impulse to fix it, to let the full shape of the problem land before he started talking about solutions. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many suppliers does the mill use regularly?" "6," she said. "Mercer's the second largest." "Who's the largest?" "Harlan Boone. He's independent. No Eastern contracts. Sells to 3 different mills. Whitmore can't touch him easily." She paused. "But if Harlan hears that Mercer pulled out, He might pull out just from the uncertainty. Men follow each other's fear sometimes. "Then we go see Harlan Boone tomorrow," Adrian said. "And the others?" "All of them. This week." She looked at him. "That's a great deal of riding." "I know it." He met her eyes. "You don't have to come to all of—" "Don't finish that sentence," she said. He didn't. Harlan Boone was 63 years old, built like a fence post, and entirely unimpressed by Gerald Whitmore, which he made clear in the first 90 seconds of conversation by using 3 words for Whitmore that Catherine chose not to repeat in polite company. He shook Adrian's hand, then shook Catherine's hand with the same firmness, and said he wasn't going anywhere. "Your father was a straight dealer," Harlan said to Catherine. "So are you, from what I hear. I don't abandon straight dealers because some land-fat old man waves his money around." He squinted at Adrian. "You planning to take that mill seriously, or is this a rich man's hobby?" "I'm planning to expand the eastern wheel capacity by spring," Adrian said. Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Then, "Good. I've got more grain than one wheel can handle anyway." He stuck out his hand again. "You've got my word." 3 of the other 4 suppliers held when Catherine and Adrian visited them personally. The 4th, young Thomas Ellery, who'd inherited his father's operation 2 years ago and was still finding his footing, wavered for an entire uncomfortable conversation before Adrian said, quietly, "Whitmore's contracts expire in March. What happens to your eastern buyers when he renegotiates and finds someone cheaper?" Ellery had not thought about that. "He does it every 3 years, Adrian said. "He's done it to 4 suppliers in the last decade. Check with any of them." He let that sit. "The mill's not going anywhere, Thomas. You might want to think about who'll still be standing come spring." They were back in the carriage before Catherine said, "You knew that, about his contracts." "I looked into his business practices before we went to see him," Adrian said. "I wanted to know what we were dealing with." "When did you find time to—" "The night after we visited him." He looked at her. "I don't sleep much." She filed that away. She was still learning the daily shape of him, the way he was up before the house, the way he read at the table rather than making conversation that didn't mean anything, the way he went still and watchful when something bothered him, instead of filling the air with noise about it. She was still finding the outline of the man she'd married and discovering, at regular intervals, that it was larger than she'd thought. They were managing. That was the honest word for those first weeks. Not perfectly, not without tension. There had been 3 arguments, 2 of which she still believed she'd won. But managing, moving in the same direction, learning each other's silences. What she had not expected was Oliver. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Whitmore's first move, without writing ahead, which she was starting to think was a family trait. She was at the desk in the study when Mrs. Pell announced him, and she came out into the hall to find him standing with his hat in his hands, looking slightly less put together than she remembered, with the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed a speech and is no longer certain it's any good. "Oliver," she said. "Catherine." He looked at her steadily. Whatever guilt lived in him, he was carrying it properly, not drowning in it, not performing it, just holding it like a man who knew what he'd done and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "I should have come sooner. I wasn't sure I'd be welcome." "You're welcome," she said. "Come in." They sat in the parlor. Mrs. Pell brought tea without being asked, which meant she was listening from the hallway, which Catherine decided was fine. "I owe you an apology," Oliver said. "More than one." "You don't have to—" "I do," he said it firmly. "I agreed to that arrangement knowing I wasn't the right man for it. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself you'd be well taken care of, and that was enough." His jaw tightened. That was a coward's reasoning. "You made it right," she said. I made it right 3 weeks before a wedding that never should have been arranged in the first place. He set down his tea. I'm sorry I cost you those months. I'm sorry you had to walk into that church not knowing what was waiting. She looked at him. She thought about everything she could say. About the debt months of uncertainty had cost her. About the nights she'd spent folding things up and putting them away. About the woman she'd been trying to become before she walked through that door. She thought about all of it. I'm not, she said. He blinked. I'm not sorry about the church, she said. I'm sorry about the months before it. But the church, she paused. The church was the first honest thing that had happened in a year. I think I needed it that way. Out loud and in front of everyone, so there was no taking it back. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Something in his face settled. You sound happy, he said, like it surprised him and pleased him at the same time. I sound determined, she said. Happy is a work in progress. He smiled at that. The small, real smile she'd seen once before, in the parlor of her old house, the last time they'd spoken as nearly married people. Adrian's a difficult man to know, he said. He always has been. He keeps everything inside, she said. Yes, exactly. He looked at his hands. He's kept that particular thing inside for a very long time, Catherine. Since before William died. He never said a word, but I watched him. When your name came up, when William talked about going home to see you, he shook his head. I knew. I think I knew before he did. She absorbed that. He would have let it go, Oliver said quietly. If I hadn't stepped back, he would have buried it completely and never said a word and done everything right by everyone and been miserable every day for the rest of his life. That's how he operates. I know, she said. Don't let him do that, Oliver said. He's better than that. You bring something out in him. I saw it the first time I watched them together. He actually... Oliver paused, searching for it. He actually stops calculating when you're in the room. You're the only person I've ever seen do that to him. She heard that and didn't know what to do with it, so she set it aside carefully, the way she set aside things that mattered too much to look at directly. Oliver stayed for dinner. Adrian came in from the South Fields to find his brother at the table and stopped in the doorway for one long moment, and then crossed the room and took Oliver's hand in a grip that lasted several seconds longer than a handshake needed to. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Over dinner, Oliver said, I heard about Whitmore. Adrian and Catherine both looked at him. Word travels, Oliver said simply. What he's doing to the suppliers, it's being talked about. He turned his glass in his hands. There are people in Charlottesville who don't like it, who don't like him, for that matter. He's been operating this way for 30 years, and some of the older families remember exactly how he built that Eastern Empire of his. What are you telling us? Adrian said. I'm telling you that you're not as alone in this as you might think. Oliver leaned forward. There's a man named Fletcher, Robert Fletcher, has the Richmond law practice. He's been building a case against Whitmore's grain contract manipulation for 2 years. Hasn't had enough evidence to move on it. Oliver looked at Catherine. The debt acquisition. The way he bought those notes in May with coordination across 3 firms. Fletcher thinks that might be exactly what he needs. Catherine went still. Coordinated debt acquisition to force a property judgment. It's not illegal on its face, Oliver said. But if Fletcher can demonstrate that Whitmore coordinated it with intent to defraud, that the intent was to acquire land below value through engineered financial pressure, he spread his hands. That's a fraud claim, Catherine said. A substantial one. Adrian was looking at Oliver with the expression he reserved for situations that required rapid reassessment. How do you know Fletcher? He's my wife's cousin, Oliver said. Catherine blinked. "You're married?" Oliver had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Last month. Her name is Eleanor. She's very direct, and she laughs at her own jokes." He paused. "You'll like her." Adrian looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You've been busy." "You're not the only one who can move fast when he finally decides to stop standing still," Oliver said. There was no accusation in it, just two brothers, long past the point where scores needed keeping. The Fletcher meeting was arranged for the following week. It took one morning and 3 hours of conversation for Robert Fletcher to review the documents Catherine had saved. Every letter, every bank notice, the original note acquisition records Thomas Greer had traced, and to confirm what they'd suspected. "This is actionable," Fletcher said. He was a lean, sharp-eyed man who moved through documents the way Adrian moved through a room, with the economy of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. The coordination across 3 firms alone is problematic for him. The timing, May, exactly when you were in active marriage negotiation with an Ashfield, establishes clear intent to exploit. He was trying to force the property into judgment before Ashfield money could close the door. "Can you stop him?" Catherine asked. "I can do more than stop him." Fletcher looked at her. "I can make the last 30 years of how he's done business very uncomfortable. The grain contract manipulation, the supplier coercion." He tapped the papers. "This debt acquisition isn't isolated. It fits a pattern, and courts don't like patterns." "How long?" Adrian said. 6 months to build the full case properly. Maybe less if Whitmore makes another move and gives us more material." Fletcher paused. "He will make another move. Men like him can't help it. They've been winning for so long, they don't know what caution looks like." He was right. Whitmore's next move came 8 days later, and it wasn't what any of them expected. It came in the form of a woman. Her name was Frances Alcott, and she arrived at the Ashfield house on a Wednesday morning, announced by Mrs. Pell with the careful tone she reserved for situations she couldn't categorize. Frances was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with the composed manner of a woman who had been sent to do something she found mildly distasteful, but intended to do correctly. She asked to see Catherine alone. Adrian was in the study. Catherine could have gone to get him. She didn't. She sat across from Frances Alcott in the parlor and waited. "Mrs. Ashfield," Frances said, "I'm not going to pretend this visit is something other than what it is. I'm an old acquaintance of Gerald Whitmore's family. He asked me to come." "I know," Catherine said. "He sent a woman because he thought I'd respond differently than I'd respond to a man. It's a reasonable calculation. He's wrong, but it's reasonable." Frances looked at her steadily. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, or perhaps something closer to respect, making a reluctant appearance. "He's offering a settlement," she said. "The mill access as before. In exchange, he removes all pressure on your suppliers, permanently. Full contracts, guaranteed for 5 years. "The mill access is my family's land," Catherine said. "It's not a bargaining chip." "He's aware you view it that way. He's asking you to view it differently." "Tell me something," Catherine said. "Do you believe this is fair?" Frances blinked. It was clearly not the question she'd been prepared for. "You came here to do someone else's asking," Catherine said. "I'm asking you something now. Do you think what he's doing is fair?" A long silence. Frances set her gloves on her knee. She looked at her hands. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." "Then tell him it didn't work." Catherine stood. "And Mrs. Alcott, you seem like a capable woman. Whatever history you have with that family, I'd think carefully about which direction you want to be standing when this resolves." Frances left without another word. but at the door she paused, just briefly, and said, without turning around, "Your father said something similar to Gerald once, 30 years ago." Gerald didn't listen then, either. She walked out. Catherine stood in the parlor doorway for a moment after the carriage left. Adrian appeared at her shoulder. He'd heard the carriage come out of the study. "He sent a messenger?" he said. "He's getting nervous," Catherine said. "Good. He's getting nervous, which means he's going to stop being careful." She turned to look at Adrian. "Fletcher said that's when men like him make mistakes." "What do you want to do?" She thought about Francis Alcott saying, "Your father said something similar." She thought about 30 years of Whitmore's patient, grinding acquisition of everything in his path. She thought about Jacob Mercer's boots and the misery in his eyes. "I want to end this," she said. "Not just for us. For every supplier he's coerced. For every family that's had to make a choice between their livelihood and their principles because of that man." Adrian looked at her with that steady gray attention that still, after 3 weeks of marriage, had the capacity to knock the breath slightly out of her if she wasn't prepared for it. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need." "I need you to trust me to lead this," she said, "completely. Not standing slightly behind me, not managing me. Fully." He didn't hesitate. "I always have." "I know," she said. "I just needed to hear you say it out loud." She went to write to Fletcher that afternoon with a new set of documents she'd been compiling for 2 weeks. Records she hadn't shown anyone yet, not even Adrian. Records that Thomas Greer had helped her trace quietly, carefully, beginning the morning after she'd first seen the death letter. She'd been building this case before she knew she was building it, before she had a name for what she was doing. She'd just been doing what her father had taught her to do, and William after him, and what 27 years of managing alone had made second nature. She knew how to watch. She knew how to wait. And she knew, with the certainty of someone who had run out of things to be afraid of, exactly when to move. The documents Catherine sent to Fletcher were not what he expected. She knew that from the way he went quiet on the other side of the table when he opened the first folder. A particular quality of silence that belonged to men who thought they already understood a situation and had just discovered they were standing in a much larger room than they'd realized. "Where did you get these?" he said. "I traced them myself. With Thomas Greer." She sat across from him with her hands folded. Adrian sat beside her and said nothing. "Starting the morning after the debt letter arrived." Fletcher turned another page, then another. "This is a purchase record from 1809. Whitmore acquired the Dunmore property that year through the same method. 3 separate creditors, coordinated notes, called simultaneously. The Dunmore family had no solicitor and no recourse. They sold at a quarter of the land's value. Catherine kept her voice even. "I found 2 more after that, 1811 and 1813. Different families, same structure." Fletcher looked up. "You've documented 3 prior instances of the same scheme." "4, including mine, except mine didn't work." The silence in that room had a different quality now. Fletcher was looking at her the way people sometimes looked at her when they'd come in expecting one thing and gotten something else entirely. Not condescension revised, but a genuine recalibration. "Mrs. Ashfield," he said carefully, "this changes the scope of what we're working with, considerably." "I know," she said. "That's why I brought it." Adrian reached over and put his hand over hers on the table. Not to settle her, she was settled, just because he wanted to. She turned her palm up and held his hand without looking at him, and Fletcher, to his credit, didn't comment on it. "This isn't a single fraud case anymore," Fletcher said. He was already reorganizing the papers with the focused energy of a man revising everything he'd planned. With 4 documented instances, this becomes a pattern of conduct. Systematic predatory acquisition. That's a different argument in front of a judge, and it's a significantly more powerful one. "How long?" Adrian said. 2 weeks to formalize the filing. I want to depose Thomas Greer and at least 2 of the prior families if they'll speak." Fletcher looked at Catherine. "Will they?" "The Dunmores moved to Kentucky in 1810. The Hargrove family from the 1811 case still lives 12 miles west of Charlottesville." She paused. "I've already spoken to them." Fletcher set down his pen. "You've already spoken to them?" "Last week," she said. "They'll speak." Fletcher looked at Adrian. Adrian looked back at him with an expression that said, very plainly, that he had learned some time ago not to be surprised by this. "Right," Fletcher said. He picked his pen back up. 2 weeks, then. Possibly less. He was right that it was less. It took 11 days. The filing landed in the Richmond Circuit Court on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, word had reached Charlottesville, because word always reached Charlottesville by afternoon, when it concerned someone powerful enough to make the reaching worthwhile. By Friday, Jacob Mercer was at the Ashfield door. He looked better than the last time Catherine had seen him. Still square and sun-weathered, still the same good man underneath it, but with something restored in his bearing. The look of a man who has been relieved of a weight he'd been pretending wasn't there. "I heard," he said. "I assumed you would," she said. "I want to come back." He turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture Oliver had made in her parlor what felt like a lifetime ago. "If you'll have me back. I know I pulled out when things got difficult, and I'm not going to make excuses for it. I'm just going to tell you it won't happen again and ask you to believe me." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about being the kind of woman who made people earn things the long way, who kept a tally and let men feel the weight of it. She thought about what that kind of woman would have for company at the end of it. "Come Monday," she said. "Harlan Boone's bringing his first load. You can come the same morning." Jacob let out a breath that had been waiting a long time. "Thank you, Catherine." "Mrs. Ashfield," she said, but she said it without heat, and he heard the difference. He smiled. He put his hat back on. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and left. Martha was in the hallway. She'd heard everything, as she always did. She met Catherine's eyes and gave one short, decisive nod, the way she used to when Catherine was 12 years old and had done something correctly after getting it wrong several times. It was the highest praise in Martha's vocabulary. Catherine took it and held it quietly. The first week after the filing, Whitmore was silent. The second week, he was still silent, and his silence was louder than anything he could have said. Fletcher reported that Whitmore's own solicitors had requested a 2-week extension from the court, which Fletcher had contested and partially won, a compromise of 10 days. "He's stalling," Fletcher said. "He's looking for a way out that doesn't cost him everything." "He won't find one," Catherine said. "No," Fletcher agreed. "He won't." Oliver came back the following Sunday with Eleanor, who turned out to be a small, bright-eyed woman with dark hair and the manner of someone who found most situations genuinely interesting rather than performing interest as a social obligation. She shook Catherine's hand with both of hers and said, "I have been wanting to meet you since Oliver told me about the church. I almost went myself just to watch." Catherine liked her immediately and completely. Over dinner, with all 4 of them at the table, Oliver said, "Whitmore's been making quiet visits to people on the court's witness list." Adrian looked up. "Not threatening," Oliver said quickly. "Or Not overtly, just visiting, reminding people of old relationships, old favors. He looked at Catherine. The Hargrove family, specifically. I heard through Eleanor's cousin that he came to see them on Wednesday. Catherine set down her fork. He went to see the Hargroves? He was there 2 hours. She was already thinking through it. The Hargroves were good people. She'd sat with Margaret Hargrove in her kitchen for an entire afternoon and listened to her describe what 1811 had taken from her family, with a clarity and a controlled grief that had made Catherine's chest ache. Margaret had said yes to testifying without hesitating, but she was 61 years old, and her husband wasn't well. And 2 hours with Gerald Whitmore, carrying 30 years of accumulated Virginia social power, was not nothing. I need to go see them tomorrow, Catherine said. We, Adrian said. She looked at him. We, he said again. Just the one word. No qualification. They rode out first thing Monday morning. Margaret Hargrove met them on her porch. She was a tall woman, still straight-backed, with white hair pinned severely, and hands that had worked a farm for 40 years and showed every year of it. She looked at Catherine, then at Adrian, then back at Catherine. He came, she said. It wasn't a question. I heard, Catherine said. Are you all right? I'm old, Margaret said. I've been managing men like Gerald Whitmore since before you were born. She held the door open. Come in. I made coffee. Sitting at Margaret's kitchen table, Catherine learned several things in quick succession. First, that Whitmore had come in a conciliatory mood, which Margaret had recognized immediately as more dangerous than his hostile moods, because it meant he was frightened. Second, that he had offered the Hargroves a sum of money to decline to testify, not to recant anything, just to be unavailable. Third, that Margaret Hargrove had told him, in language she was willing to repeat verbatim, and that made Adrian press his mouth flat to keep from smiling, exactly where he could put that offer. I'm testifying, Margaret said. She looked at Catherine with the directness of a woman who had earned every year of her age. 32 years I've carried what that man did to my family. My husband lost 10 years of his health to the stress of that judgment. I'm not going to be quiet about it because Gerald Whitmore finally got scared enough to come sit in my kitchen and be polite. She set down her coffee cup. You just make sure Fletcher knows what I told you about the visit. That's witness tampering, or near enough. Fletcher knew within the hour. He was deeply pleased. This, he said, reading Catherine's note, is exactly the kind of mistake I said he'd make. The court date was set for a Wednesday in October. It was the kind of morning that felt like it meant something. Cool and clear, the light coming in at an angle that made everything look slightly more significant than it was, which October mornings in Virginia had a talent for. Catherine wore her mother's second-best dress. Not the one she'd worn to the wedding. She was saving that for something she hadn't defined yet. But the dark blue wool, the one with the plain buttons and the good collar that said, I'm not here to impress you. I'm here to outlast you. Martha helped her with the buttons in silence. When she was done, she stepped back and looked at Catherine for a moment. Your mother would have had something to say, Martha said. She always had something to say. She would have told you to stand straight and speak clearly, and not let them see you worry. I know. Catherine met her eyes in the mirror. I'm not worried. Martha's expression shifted, something behind her eyes that was not quite grief and not quite pride, but held both inside it. I know you're not, she said quietly. That's what she would have said about you. At the end. She smoothed the non-existent wrinkle from Catherine's shoulder. That's what William would have said too. Catherine held that for a moment. Then she breathed, slowly, all the way out. Let's go, she said. The courtroom in Charlottesville was fuller than Fletcher had anticipated. He said so in a low voice when they came in, with the tone of a man revising his expectations upward. Word had moved, not just through Charlottesville, but through the surrounding counties, along the same channels that Whitmore's own influence had always traveled, now carrying something different. Every supplier who'd been coerced, every family who'd watched a neighbor lose land and wondered if they were next, every man who'd smiled at Whitmore across a table and gone home that night calculating the risk of disagreeing with him. They were all here, or they'd sent someone to be here for them. Whitmore arrived with 2 solicitors and the controlled bearing of a man who had decided that the dignified approach was his best remaining option. He did not look at Catherine when he entered. That told her everything. A man who was confident looked at the opposition. A man who was afraid looked away. Fletcher presented for 2 hours. He was methodical and devastating, which was exactly the combination required. Not theatrical, not emotional, just the plain, documented shape of 30 years of the same machine operating on the same principle and taking what wasn't his. The Hargrove testimony took 40 minutes. Margaret Hargrove spoke without notes and without hesitation, and the courtroom was so quiet during certain parts of it that Catherine could hear the woman 2 rows back trying not to cry. When it was Whitmore's solicitor's turn, he spoke for an hour. He used words like coincidence and standard business practice and no demonstrable intent. He was good at his job. It didn't matter. The documents were what they were. The pattern was what it was. You could describe a fox in very favorable terms, but at the end of the argument, it was still a fox, and the hens were still gone. The judge recessed for 90 minutes. Catherine sat in the hallway with Adrian on her left and Oliver on her right, and Eleanor across from her, and Martha, who had come without being asked and without any discussion, simply arrived at the courthouse and taken a seat, as if she'd been on the witness list all along, beside Eleanor. Nobody said much. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said, nothing left to do that hadn't been done. It was the particular stillness of people who have done their work and are now waiting for the world to decide what it makes of that. Oliver said, "Whatever happens, don't," Adrian said. "I was going to say something useful." "You were going to say, whatever happens, we're all right. And we are. But I don't want to say it out loud right now." Adrian kept his eyes forward. "It feels like counting the chickens." "Fair enough," Oliver said. Catherine sat between them and thought about her father turning Whitmore down twice. Quiet and certain, with the assurance of a man who knew the value of what he had. She thought about William, who'd ridden away to a war he didn't fully believe in because he thought it was his duty, and never came back. She thought about the letter from a man she hadn't met yet. "I am a man who keeps his promises," burning in her fireplace, while Martha watched and said nothing. She thought about all the folding up and putting away, all the things she'd taught herself not to want, because wanting them was a liability she couldn't afford. She thought, "I'm done with that." The bailiff called them back. The judge was a compact, gray-haired man named Harrison, who had the manner of someone who'd been doing this long enough to find most human behavior predictable and was only occasionally surprised. He looked at his papers for a moment before he spoke. Then he looked up, and he looked at Whitmore. And something in his expression made Fletcher, standing slightly behind Catherine's right shoulder, exhale very quietly. The ruling took 4 minutes to deliver. Systematic predatory acquisition was the phrase that landed hardest. The judge used it twice, which Fletcher later said was deliberate, which meant something in judicial language. The debt acquisitions were declared fraudulent instruments. The Brennan liens were voided retroactively. The Hargrove judgment from 1811 was referred to a separate remediation proceeding, Whitmore's Eastern grain contracts were flagged for a market conduct review by a Richmond oversight body. He did not take the mill land. He would not take any of it. Outside the courthouse, in the cool October air, Fletcher shook Catherine's hand, and then Adrian's, and said, "I've been practicing law in this state for 18 years. That was the cleanest set of documents I have ever taken into a courtroom." He paused. "Your father would have been a formidable man to litigate against." "He was a formidable man at everything," Catherine said. Jacob Mercer was waiting on the steps. He'd been there the whole time. When she came out, he took off his hat and held it against his chest and didn't say anything, which was more than words. Harlan Boone was there too, further back, standing with 3 other suppliers she recognized, and he gave her one short, decisive nod that meant the same thing Martha's nods meant, that she'd done something correctly, and he'd noticed, and that was all that needed saying. Frances Alcott was there. Catherine hadn't expected that. The woman stood at the far edge of the crowd, well-dressed as before, with the careful composure that was clearly habitual. When Catherine's eyes found her, Frances gave a very small, very deliberate nod. Not congratulations exactly, something older and quieter. Recognition. The acknowledgement of one woman who had watched what another woman had just done and understood exactly what it had cost. Catherine nodded back. The drive home was quiet. The good kind of quiet, the kind that comes after something significant has been resolved and the people inside it don't need to narrate it for each other because they were all there. Martha sat across from her and closed her eyes and appeared to sleep, though Catherine had never once in 20 years seen Martha actually sleep in a carriage, so she suspected it was more that Martha had decided the moment called for privacy and was providing it in the most practical way available. Oliver and Eleanor rode in their own carriage behind, and at a crossroads a mile from the Ashfield estate, they turned off for the Oliver Ashfield property. He'd purchased a modest farm 6 miles east, which Eleanor had immediately started improving with the decisive energy of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and saw no reason to wait for permission. And Catherine watched their carriage take the other road and felt something settle in her chest that she had no single word for. It was something like whole. Adrian was looking at her. She turned and found him watching her with that gray, unblinking attention that she had long since stopped trying to deflect. He reached over and tucked a piece of hair back from her face. Just that. Just the single gesture, with the quiet care of someone who had learned the particular geography of another person and intended to keep learning it for a very long time. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant it in years. "We should talk about the East Wheel expansion," he said. "I've been thinking about the spring timeline and whether—" "Adrian." He stopped. "Not today," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. That same almost smile she'd been watching for months. The one that didn't come all the way out very often, but when it did, it changed his entire face. Made him look like a man who had, against considerable odds, ended up somewhere he hadn't dared to plan for. "No," he agreed. "Not today." They were home before dark. Martha made tea without being asked. She set it on the table and stood back and looked at Catherine. Just looked at her. The way she'd been looking at her for 27 years. Through every loss and every hard winter and every morning that required getting up and doing it again. And said nothing at all. Catherine picked up her cup. The tea was hot. She drank it. 2 months later, in December, when the first hard frost had come and the Brennan mill was running at full capacity with a waiting list that stretched into March, Catherine discovered she was expecting a child. She sat with that knowledge for a full morning before she told Adrian, not because she was afraid of it, but because she wanted the time to feel it fully before it became something shared. to hold it in both hands for a moment and understand that this, too, was something she hadn't let herself want. Something she'd folded up and put away in the part of herself that had gotten very good at loss. She found him in the south fields. Of course she did. He looked up when he heard her horse, and something in her face must have spoken before she did, because he was already moving toward her before she'd dismounted. "Catherine." "We're going to need a larger study," she said. He went very still. "What?" "The east wing," she said. "The room that gets the morning light. I'd like to convert it." She watched his face. She watched everything she'd been watching for. Everything she'd been too afraid to watch for too long, move through him in sequence. Shock first, then something that broke the surface of every careful, controlled thing he carried, and then something so unguarded and so plain that it was almost painful to see. "It's a good room, south-facing for warmth, quiet." He crossed the last distance between them and took her face in his hands and looked at her with every wall down, nothing in reserve, and she looked back at him the same way. No folding, no putting away, nothing held at a careful distance for protection. "Catherine," he said again, and her name in his voice was still, after everything, the most honest sound she'd ever heard. "I know," she said. He kissed her forehead. He held her there for a long moment in the cold December morning, with his hands warm on either side of her face. And she let him. And she held onto the front of his coat and let the weight of it land. All of it. The whole improbable, difficult, unplanned architecture of the year that had brought her here. And found that she was strong enough to hold it. She had always been strong enough. It had just taken the right person standing next to her, finally, without flinching, for her to stop spending all that strength on standing alone. A year after Catherine Brennan had stood at a church door, with her hand pressed flat against the wood and her legs refusing to move. She stood in the east wing of the Ashfield estate with morning light coming in, and Adrian beside her, and a life neither of them had planned, but both of them had earned. And she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had fought for every single thing she had, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. This was not an accident, and it was not a rescue, and it was not a promise kept to a dead man. It was two people who had chosen each other, fully, honestly, out loud. And that was the only thing it had ever needed to be.